Today we're going to look at composition. So what is composition? Composition is the arrangement of the elements of the photo and how they're presented in the frame. So how we organize our photographic frame. Now, historically, we tend to initially want to just put our subject right in the center of the frame. And there's a few reasons for that. One, most cameras, their autofocus sets up to have the most sensor points in the center of the frame. So we know if we have our camera lens on autofocus, we can just put the person in the middle and we'll know they're nice and sharp and focused, and we'll take that picture. So this is a standard autofocus grid. Most cameras come with this 9-point grid system, and you would see that it is center weighted so that the focus initially grabs for the center. So if you wanted to turn on your live view mode grid, you could access it through the menu button on the back of your camera. You go to the camera live view menu. You of course want to make sure it's enabled. And then there's grid display, and you can turn that on, and there's several choices. So the 3x3 would give you the rule of thirds, which is basically drawing a tic-tac-toe board on your image and then framing your picture along these compositional grid lines or at the intersection point of two lines. So along the full line or at the intersection point. So let's look at some sample images. So this picture, we see that the cheetah is sitting along the 1/3 line, and then its head's here at the intersection point. There's also a third line activated in this photo, and that is the look and the gaze. It's called a look line or a line of force that's coming from the eyes, and it's going across this other thirds line. And now it's really important when you are composing a composition and you have someone looking in the frame, animal or person, to make sure that there is space for them to look across the frame. If we had composed this picture and put the cheetah on this line looking out, his look line would be very truncated and it would create an uncomfortable looking image. Now, one thing you'll notice, because he's on this thirds line, this image isn't as balanced as we saw some of those images where they were centered. But again, his looking across the plane helps activate this quadrant as well. I like to show this image because I always get students who wonder, oh, it's cloudy or foggy or it's raining, I can't take good pictures. And I like to show this because it proves that, you know, fog can be beautiful, rain can really create stunning images. You just have to be careful to keep your camera as dry as possible. So the tree is composed on the thirds, the branches are going out across the other thirds line. So as you can see with the rule of thirds, it's fairly simple to compose on, but some of the images can look a little forced, just predictable with that where they're located in the frame. So there's another compositional grid method, which is called the Fibonacci sequence. And it is a mathematical sequence that creates this logarithmic spiral. And this tends to look less forced in the photographic composition, but it is a little bit more technical. So the golden ratio is a set of mathematical numbers that go for each quarter turn. You add the numbers before, the two numbers before, and they create the next quadrant. And it ends up making that grid. This is a mathematical sequence. And it's an irrational number that ends up being equivalent to 1.618 and is symbolized by the phi number, just like the irrational number pi. So again, for each quarter turn, it gets one golden ratio larger, and if you connect the corners on, you create this spiral. This spiral can be found all throughout nature, and and is literally surrounding us everywhere in the world. Now, these give you a sample of where we can find the golden ratio in the world around us. So, in fact, you're carrying the golden ratio around with you. The ear is in the shape of that golden spiral. So in the golden ratio, you can also have more complex compositions where you have golden ratios or golden spirals going both directions. And you see in this daisy that we have 21 golden ratio, golden spirals going that direction, and 34 golden spirals going the other way. And this creates an almost infinite looking spiral. Another thing you can do is you can take something that grows in a golden spiral and then also compose it in that golden ratio composition. So it's put in this quadrant and it's along the golden spiral as well as growing in the golden spiral. So not just centering the plant that grows in the Fibonacci sequence, but also composing on that spiral. Now generally we say when we're composing with the Fibonacci spiral or the golden ratio is that we are composing within or at where the red lines are in this quadrant or in this one here, this little quadrant there. But you can also compose on the curve. So we can see this picture wouldn't be near as interesting if she was just sitting, say, at a desk and we didn't have any legs there, and this was all just big and blank, and she'd be just sitting and her head would be very weighted on one side. But because her feet and her body go along that spiral line, it creates a flow through the image that creates interest and movement of the eye that keeps the viewer looking at the picture longer. Here, this woman's face is at that golden ratio, and so that helps draw us. Now you'll see in this picture, our look line is truncated, so it adds tension, so there's not near as much space on this side as if she had been looking in this direction. And maybe if she had been looking in the other direction, she might have seemed a little happier or open, where she looks a little cold and closed off because of the direction she's looking. So another picture where we are composing with the whole spiral, and then we're putting that centering point on the eye of the cat. Landscapes tend to, and landscape photographers tend to use this golden spiral or this section very often for their compositions. In fact, if you take this spiral and you flip-flop it to the other corner, you create this grid that we call the phi grid. And the phi grid is just referring to the name of that golden ratio or that irrational number. And it creates a grid similar to the rule of thirds, and we'll look at that a little later. But this grid is extremely popular for landscape photography. And you can see here that what the landscape photographers do is they use the first section a lot of times for their foreground, the smaller middle section for their midground, and they put their horizon line at one or the other of these horizontal points. And then the sky in that last quadrant at the top. And what this does is it creates what feels like a very balanced image, gives us a lot of flow through the scene, but allows for fairly well divided and well proportioned image. So again, that horizon line at the top, and the foreground, midground, and sky in the back. Now, there's a few other things you can do with the golden ratio, and one thing is you can draw a line across from one corner to the other, and then you can draw another corner from there to the this line on the golden ratio. And what happens is it creates a quadrant grid like this, which we call the golden triangle. And in the golden triangle, it is another compositional aid that can help create dynamic compositions with the visual flow being across those triangular lines, and you'll often see your main focus point and a supporting leg or supporting point that gives a sense of grounding. Triangles are a very sturdy shape to compose in. They give a very solid feel to images, and we see them throughout the photographic history. And again, they help compose with a fairly balanced feel to them because of how the elements align. So, like I said before, the golden ratio and the rule of thirds are somewhat similar, especially if you look at the phi grid, which is the blue grid here, and the rule of thirds, which is the red grid. So when it boils down to it, we really have the choice of one or the other, but we can use or both when we're choosing to compose, and each has their plus and minuses. And so just a reminder, you have the rule of thirds, which is 9 equal quadrants, the golden section or the phi grid, which is a slightly closer interior section, the spiral section, so this composing in this quadrant or in this box, and then the golden spiral, which would be composing, or the Fibonacci spiral, which would be composing on the line. And just the flip-flopped version over there of the golden triangle. So you have a lot of different options when choosing to compose mathematically, and I hope this gives you some inspiration in trying some of these yourself. So here's some tips and tricks for composing when you're out in the field or if you're doing a studio shot. So what I did when I took my first photo class 20 some odd years ago is we would make these little viewfinder grids, and you can do this by just drawing a frame and cutting out, or you can glue on string to create the divider lines. And what you can do is actually use that to help compose. And this one is for thirds, and you can see that this composition is done on the thirds grid. And if we took the picture inside this frame, it would be proportional. Now you can also cut one out for the phi grid, and again, the phi grid is used mostly for landscape photography, although you can still use it for still life, and you can see that also creates a nice composition inside the frame. And then lastly, I don't know if this composition will really work for it, but there's the golden triangle. And again, you're just cutting out that design, and you can use it to compose with. And you see we can put that one camera in the triangle here and use that compositional line across the case. Now, one last tip I'd like to show you, because sometimes, although making these and using them are very, very helpful, they're one more thing to carry around with you. And I would say most of you have a cell phone on you, and there's an app, it's called Camera Awesome. And if you can see on this grid here, you have the option of the golden spiral, the rule of thirds grid, the golden triangle grid, or just a standard square composition. So you can overlay that grid on the scene. I'll just zoom in here and get, it's a little hard to do, there we go. And you can see that golden ratio overlaid over the camera, and so that you know you're using these compositional tools correctly. So these are just some helpful hints. I think that the cell phone technology one is probably my favorite, because obviously I have my phone in my pocket or in my bag when I'm out photographing, so I don't have to worry about carrying around something else or breaking these little intersection points when I'm out in the field. All right, guys, so I hope that gives you some ideas on helpful tips for photographing with the golden ratio, rule of thirds, and the golden triangle.